All right, everybody can hear me all right, I hope. Welcome again to REcon 18. Before I dive into anything, I think it's very much worthwhile giving another round of applause for Ben and the UX INXS team, as well as Bloomberg for making this happen, especially for free on a Saturday, and all of this great food and speakers like Jim. Just one more time, round of applause for these folks. It takes a lot of work to put something like this together. Trust me, I know, and so this is really great, and it's been very impressive so far. So I'm going to talk about the state of user research. It's very much like and inspired after the State of the Union address that we have here in our country. What's going on in user research? What's happening in the country? What are we thinking about? What do we think is going to happen in the future? What are we working towards? I am certainly not the president of user research, but I'm relatively involved in a number of communities that I want to kind of like bring a lot of things that we're seeing and hearing and doing to the forefront today and talk about what's happening in research. So that's me. Gentleman in the streets, freak at his son's birthday party. And I pull this picture of myself up because I'm hoping this gives you an idea of what you can expect at this talk. So anybody here ever heard of the company? I believe it was Unbounce. It's a marketing page type company. Okay, so I steal this quote from one of their founders. When he gives talks, he says, "I aim to be delicious and nutritious." And so, which is to say, I hope that you get something informational, maybe even inspirational out of the talk that I'm going to give today, but also have a little bit of fun. And I just have to say how honored I am to be here, to be able to have your attention, have this conversation with you on a Saturday morning, no less, in a great city like New York where there's no shortage of stuff to do. So thank you. It means a lot to me to be able to share with you. Okay, so a little bit more about me and kind of context as to why I'm talking about this and where some of my thoughts and opinions in this talk are coming from. So I'm the CEO, co-founder of Aurelius. What we are is a user research and insights platform for, big surprise, people like us. It's very much my background as a researcher and product strategy person. We kind of decided to build software and our own tool to solve our own problem. I mention this because as part of that, we actually have a podcast that we run. We interview a number of industry leaders and folks that I'm quite sure you know, like Jim, in fact, of which I'm the host. And so there's a lot of things that we're hearing from these people, the industry leaders like Jim. We come to talks like this, we hear what's happening in the industry and what should be important to us. I'm also vice president of the UXPA for Minnesota, which is where I live currently in Minneapolis. And I bring that up because through that, I work with a lot of the programming and both seasoned as well as brand new UX and research people to figure out like what questions are they looking to get answered, what kind of content and information are they looking to learn about. And then finally, pretty active contributor to the global ResearchOps community. So this is a Slack channel started by, as she calls herself, Chief Instigator Kate Towsey, ResearchOps manager at Atlassian. And so what I'm going to share is information and exposure that we've had from all of these different communities, as well as building a company and a product for people like us. So on the menu today, we are going to talk about DesignOps, ResearchOps, as Ben said, a little bit some of those trends and stuff that I see in user research and that State of the Union type thing. I will share actual examples and stories of things that we've done in Aurelius based on very introspective look, right? Holding the mirror up and saying, well, what is it that we actually are trying to do? And the theme of our conference is designing the future of research, so we would be crazy not to talk about what the future holds for research. The first theme I want to bring up, and probably not a surprise to you, but also the good news, is that it is and always has been about empathy. So Jim talked about empathy, right? And what we're hearing in research and the outcome of our jobs as researchers is about building an institutional knowledge about the people we serve, our customers, our users, whatever you call them at the place that you work. But empathy isn't just about doing research and sharing what you found to take action on that at that point in time. The true impact of empathy comes when everybody's intuition about the people we serve gets better. That's what builds that institutional knowledge. But But there's an interesting thing about empathy. We talk a lot about empathy for our customers, our users, the people we're making something for. But empathy has to extend beyond that, actually turn back inward on the people we work with and for. So this is a quote from Christina Woodkey on one of our podcast episodes. She's brilliant. If you don't know who she is, I highly encourage you to look her up. But she says a lot of designers out there have no idea how their company makes money. Now, I won't call anybody out here, and I won't ask for a show of hands, but ask yourself that question. Do you know how the product and services that you work on are actually profitable and good for the business? It's just a question worth asking, and if you don't, it might be worth trying to figure that out. I want to tell you a story of something that happened to me when I was working with a mobile app team. Okay? So I came in, and the situation looked a lot like this. There was a broken mobile app experience. Delicious part. We'll get back to the nutritious. It was a broken mobile app experience, right? The team, being the design team, the tech team, the product team, was very frustrated. A lot of the reasons for that was because there was an ad hoc process where decisions were getting made based on complete guesses or gut reactions, or worse yet, I'm sure it's never happened to you, somebody with a higher title in the room, right? All of this eventually led to, as you might imagine, a lack of trust in design. So that kind of sucks. Nobody wants to work in that situation. And I came into this, and what was asked was the team redesign the landing screen for the app. That's it, the home screen of the mobile app, right? Pretty simple task. So naturally, I went in and recommended we redesign the entire thing in the navigation so you can find it easier. That didn't go over well, even with the team I was working with, okay? And they're never going to go for it. The stakeholders are not going to go for that. They asked us for a new icon, basically. They wanted a new home screen landing page. You're going to freak them out. Okay. The first meeting we had, that team was right. They were freaked out. In fact, the stakeholder for the project, the stakeholder turned to the one designer in this meeting, drew on a piece of paper what he wanted and handed it to the designer and said, just do that. Probably not an awesome situation to be in, right? So that meeting ended. The very next day, I started scheduling conversations with those stakeholders. The director of the mobile app, the vice president of marketing, who was even that person's boss. And what I did is I had conversations. You might call them stakeholder interviews. It doesn't really matter. But I asked them, well, tell me about what your job is. Why do we have a mobile app? What's good for you about the mobile app? And what can we do that would actually make you look good and be good for the company so that everybody kind of wins out of this? We came out with a number of goals, some idea of success. I said, great, thank you for that. That's going to help us do this work. The design team went back off. We actually did a little bit of guerrilla research very quickly, came back with new recommendations and designs that were not what that VP of marketing drew on a piece of paper. In the very next meeting, there wasn't a single contention about the recommendations and the new design that we had. And the reason for that was because we applied empathy to the people we work with and for, not just for our customers. Jim, on our show, and I promise this wasn't planned, I had no idea he was talking here when I made these slides, but I'm very happy that he is because he's great. We talk about having empathy for our users, but why don't we have any empathy for the people we work with? Roles in our business. He goes on in that episode when we chatted to say that he'd encourage people to get out, learn those roles, learn those departments a little bit more often, because you can't just get frustrated and throw your hands up and say, well, they don't get it if you don't understand why they're doing it. Anybody here ever read the book How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie? Understand the person that you're working with to better sell your ideas. It's about bringing that empathy into everyday decisions, not just design projects, because as Jim talked about, we don't just work on software. We don't just work on things. We build empathy for people, and we try to serve them better. I believe practicing internal empathy allows design, allows research, the work that we do, to have a greater impact. So this theme of empathy is a big one. The good news is it always was and is about empathy. But empathy can reach beyond just the people we're trying to serve. Lindsay Redinger, also on our show, she runs research and operations at Envision, a company I'm sure many of you are familiar with, says that they have a mission of building empathy across the entire company, not just for the products and services and the people who use them. The next theme I want to talk about, of the things that we're seeing, is that research is becoming less formal, generally speaking. right? How many people here have ever had trouble selling user research? Right? A good number of us. And the reason it's becoming more formal is because oftentimes it's hard to sell research because we want to sell the craft, right? We love what we do, and that's so important, but oftentimes people don't buy the craft. We just talked about internal empathy. You don't buy a quarter-inch drill. You want a quarter-inch hole. And so the formality around research and the rigor in selling that is starting to go away a little bit. Please indulge me for a moment. I want to try and exercise. If everybody could stand up. If you're not able to stand up, that's okay. Or if you really don't want to, I'll give you a pass this time. But just stand up for a moment. I promise this won't take very long. Okay. We got just about everybody. Almost 100% success rate. I like that. Okay, so if you have not sent or received a text message in the last 48 hours, sit down. If you have not sent or received an email in the last 48 hours, sit down. Okay, so we've got one. Thank you for being brave. If you have not sent or received a handwritten letter in the last 2 weeks, sit down. Good night, nurse. The point here, everybody can sit down. Thank you for indulging me. The point here is that our culture of communication is changing to be more informal. Hence, the way we communicate research findings has become less formal. And this is where the idea of key insights and nuggets comes in. So a lot of the seminal work that's come out of this is from a person local here to New York. I'm sure many of you know, Tomer Sharon. We had him on our show as well. And one of the things that he's always very direct and upfront about is that he learned long ago research reports are extremely unuseful. That's a pretty on-the-nose statement. But if you think about even what Jim said, don't put it in a report. That's not telling the story. That's not helping connect it. I have a different angle on that where I just believe our culture of communication has come to, give me the bullet points, send me the thing, let me take action on it. But if we can build that institutional knowledge to be delivering that in a more informal way, all of a sudden research has a greater impact and reach in the organization we have. Hence comes in the idea of a key insight or a nugget. So I definitely borrow from Tomer on some of this, but there's 3 parts to a key insight for me, and at least in some of the things that I've talked about and written, and certainly the way we do it in our own product, Aurelius. So the first part of the key insight is the title. Well, that's the insight itself, right? It's the thing that you learned. When somebody goes, well, what did we learn from that research? You're going to say A, B, and C, right? That's the first part. The next one is supporting evidence. You can't make a statement of something you learned based on salt and sand, right? You should have something to back that up. And so these are the actual notes or data or more detailed observations that can back up this learning or this insight, or as Tomer would put it, this nugget. And then finally, for us, so we call them tags because quite literally it's a system that has tags and the ability to do these. But basically we're talking about metadata, descriptors of the key insight. So it's not the raw data or the notes you attach to it, right? But it's what is this thing about so that we can more easily find it and search it and reuse it later. Make sense? This is an actual screenshot of a key insight and how people, in fact, our customers are using this stuff. So very generic title, key insights are a group of things you learn from user research, right? But you see you can attach all this data there. And in this idea of research becoming less formal, I agree with Jim entirely that we're no longer writing these long-form reports because we did this and it didn't work. We sent it to people thinking that they would care so much about the craft that we had and all the meticulous detail we put in this report, and it never had the impact we wanted because all they needed was the bullet point. Tell me what I ought to do. User research is about building confidence in decision-making. And people need information to feel confident of a thing they plan to do, right? Okay, so the next piece, next theme I want to talk about, DesignOps and ResearchOps are here, and you should just deal with it. So the reason I say deal with it is because I'm sure some of you, actually show of hands, who has heard of the terms DesignOps and ResearchOps? So pretty good. Okay, most of the room, actually. I won't ask you to raise your hand for this, but I know for a fact that some of you, maybe not in this room, have groaned at the idea of ResearchOps, DesignOps. It's a new thing we're going to try to define and figure out. I disagree. It's a lot more than that. So DesignOps and ResearchOps are important for any size organization or team doing design and or doing research today. And if we're going to talk about this, I think it's worthwhile even just looking at what is operations. We have a sense, like experience. We have a sense for what operations is and means in an organization, but what does it mean for design and research? Well, so this says, in the broadest sense, operational excellence basically says it's building in efficiencies, right, in a company to build a competitive advantage. That makes enough sense, right? Like operating well to build a competitive advantage in the company that you work with and for. That's general operations in business. So me, and the way that I kind of define that, processes and outcomes to service delivery, the work that we do to ensure that it's efficient and it's of high quality in an efficient way. Does this make sense? So then, to me, what DesignOps and ResearchOps really is simply amplifying the value that design and research can have and should have in your organization. Because just like a business, if it doesn't operate properly, it can't have the value or impact outside the walls of that business, right? And the same thing, I believe, holds true for design. And so then DesignOps and ResearchOps is doing a couple things. It's trying to make better designers and researchers. And you're all here on a Saturday morning, which shows me you're pretty damn dedicated to making better designers and researchers. Because we want them to do better design and research to extend the impact of the work that we do and make sure that it's efficient so that it can happen more often. So Dave Maloof, who is part of the DesignOps Summit, which will be here next month, in fact, in New York. If any of you are going, I highly encourage. It's a great conference. He was a guest on our show as well. One of the things we talked about with DesignOps, ResearchOps, he said, you have DesignOps. It exists whether or not you're intentional about it. So just like the old saying, your customers are going to have an experience whether or not you design it. Your DesignOps actually exists whether or not you're intentional about it. Because you're doing the work, therefore the operations exist, right? And in reality, the ResearchOps is really just trying to break down walls that prevent access to, the ability to consume, the ability to do, or even act on user research. Operating efficiently allows people to break down walls and access to these things. So at this point, I want to talk about my personal experience in trying to support some of this stuff with the very company and product we built at Aurelius. So we are currently in version 2 of Aurelius. And here's the reason we're in version 2, not just because we thought it'd be cool to do a redesign. We launched this product 2 years ago. Version 2 launched February of this year, just to give you a little bit of a timeline. Now, version 1, when we started, we very much were looking inward, practicing that empathy that we thought, solving our own problem, right? And it was a product strategy platform. Because the problem we had, or the problem that we had a beef with, myself and my co-founder, was that we didn't feel like people were often making decisions that all tied back and based on research. Anybody ever have this problem? Right? And so we said, we could try to start our own consultancy to do this, or we can build software, and then that scales, and then hopefully everybody can do that work a little bit better, rather than just have to hire somebody. So we built this platform where you were able to add all of your goals and success indicators and stuff like that, like I did with the mobile app team. And it even gave you recommendations for metrics out of that. And then you can put all your research in there and tie that together. And then you can make a decision. You can attach your research to it and your goals to it. And by the way, when you're done with that, you can add all your metrics to it. That sounds kind of confusing, doesn't it? Here's what happened. We launched this product. We had paying customers. And of everybody who came to us for version 1 of Aurelius, here's what happened. 10% of them said, this is amazing. I've never seen anything like this. And I absolutely want to use this. That made us feel great. But 10% doesn't make a business profitable for anybody doing the math. The other 90% came to us and said, this is really cool. I wish we can work this way. But tell me a little bit more about like how you're doing the research and insights part of this. What we realized through doing customer research, the work that we do in listenings, we quite literally pivoted and changed the direction of the company and redesigned and redeveloped the entire product. Because what we realized is that people were trying to solve a research ops problem. It wasn't the matter of connecting all that together. They needed it to be more efficient, reusable, so that it can have a greater impact. And we launched what you see today, which brings me to my next theme, and something that we're hearing from all the exposure that we're getting and the involvement in the community and our very own customers is this idea of building a research library or an archive or a repository or a database, whatever you want to call it. But it's this idea of like, where does the knowledge of your customers live? Because you're all doing amazing work understanding what their needs and expectations are with your company, your products and services. But if it lives in a report, I'm sorry to tell you, those people are not taking that report, framing it, and hanging it up in their office and reading it again. Right? So what we realize is that people wanted this place very much like this self-service culture we get today. If you have a question, where do you go? You go to Google. So we want to become Google for your research insights. We want you to be able to come here and say, what do we know about this person? What do we know about the people we're trying to serve? Because you get this question. How many people here work in-house teams? Not a consultancy. A good bit of you. Anybody ever come up to you and say, or send you an email out of the blue, not asking for a research project, but just rather, hey, what do we know about A, B, and Z? Do we have research on X, Y, and Z? I saw a little bit of disenchanted faces, but that's okay. We hope to help you with that. Anyway, do we have any research on that? And how do you do this today? So think about this. Practice empathy on yourself. Do you want to go back and reread that report? I can tell you the answer is no. In fact, one of our customers actually told, when they saw a demo of our product and eventually started using it, they said, this is great, and the reason I like it is because it's often faster and easier for me to do new research than it is to go back and find out what I learned. This is what research operations is, part of it. And I don't claim to own the definition and title of that. There's a ton of work by the ResearchOps community and Kate Townsend and some others in this room who are working on that as well, to really define that. And there's going to be some work at the DesignOps Summit, in fact, coming up here, where they'll go into greater detail of that. But for us, and particularly what we're trying to solve, get you the answers, the confidence to turn into action that's a little bit better for people you serve every day. The next theme that we hear, and this is pretty revolutionary for me, but it's a simple concept, is research as a team sport. And again, Tomer talks about this, as well as others, but this idea of silos in research. So all of us here are researchers. Do you work on a research team? Show of hands, I'm curious. Is it a research team? Right, okay. So then somebody has to come to the research team and burn sacrificial incense and sacrifice something, right? Like, and you will give us the research and the answers. And this is not efficient. If we're talking about operations, inefficiencies kill us, right? So what we're hearing from a lot of really smart people, including Lindsay at Envision, is that it's our responsibility to share this work, the ability to do it, access to the methods, of course, the data and knowledge, that's always been our aim, but actually empowering people to do their own research. What we're seeing is that this trend moving towards researchers not just being the people who conduct the research, but the stewards of the knowledge to empower other people to get that same kind of customer understanding. And this goes all the way back to the first point I made about institutional knowledge. Empathy is about building better intuition about the people you make things for. Because the reality of it is there will be decisions, designs, features, products, business decisions that happen without a research project. We know this is true. But if we can help everybody build a better intuition that's more aligned with what we do know about what's good for customers, that intuition and those decisions get better over time. So we've been talking about DesignOps and ResearchOps. Why does any of this stuff matter? Because for me, for a very long time, what I've been talking about is this idea of design is actually a business. Research it's a business inside a business. If we think about that, and if you'll go along with my analogy here that design is a business, businesses that don't have a value proposition or some way of providing value and can operate in a way that's efficient, sustainable, or profitable will die. We've all seen, and there's a ton of startups here in New York City, right? We've all seen a bunch of companies that had great ideas, provided a ton of value, but they can't get it to market well, or they can't keep up with the demand, or A, or B, or C. So if you think about that, if you can't do design and research in a way that's consistently high quality, valuable, and sustainable to the organization, they're going to stop buying it. And I'm sure that you've all heard stories. Maybe you've even been part of teams where research was a big deal. Maybe you even scaled up a team, and then somehow, over time, that went away. There wasn't value in it anymore because we didn't extend it to have the impact in the organization it should. We are at a conference where the tagline is Designing the Future of Research. So I would be a real jerk if I came up here and did not talk about the future in a talk called The State of User Research. So there's a couple things coming out of this for me. The future holds, I believe, an automation of a lot of the things that we do today in order to improve efficiency. If you think about operations at a company, even starting way back in the beginning of the industrial era, people were freaked out about this idea of automation. Robots are going to take our jobs. I don't think that's true. And in fact, I think it's going to make us as researchers a lot better. And we hear a lot of people talking about this and even hacking some tools together today to make this work, where automating things like recruiting and scheduling and incentive management and travel and booking a room, all of this stuff that you very smart people shouldn't have to worry about. You're great at understanding people, right? So if you can just automate a lot of this work, all of a sudden research happens more efficiently and therefore is enabled to happen more often. Because the other thing that we need to keep in mind here, going back to the idea of research as a team sport, we could hire everybody in this room at one company on one team to do research, and it still would never scale infinitely because it's limited by people. But if we can automate this stuff, it allows the impact to extend beyond just a team. If we teach others to do this work better, and if some of that's automated for them so they don't have to figure this out, research can have a greater impact. Empathy can have a deeper hold in the organization we work at. The next thing for the future for me, and this is one of the most exciting things for me to talk about because we are actively working on something just like this. I believe AI comes to user research. I know for a fact, because I speak with a lot of you and we did a lot of research, surprise, a research company does research. One of the biggest time sinks that we do in research is trying to figure out what we learned. This idea of thematic analysis, right? I'm sure everybody here has done something similar to that. But you've got all this qualitative data, maybe even mixed with some quantitative data, and just how do we figure out the patterns and themes that exist across this stuff? Well, with the maturity of technology like machine learning, natural language processing, we will actually soon be seeing AI in some early forms come to user research to help us figure out what we ought to be paying attention to, and then eventually perhaps true insight. The future holds for me seeing more researchers get made. If we do that, research becomes more strategic. If we can operate and distribute the value that research provides and allow more people, think crowdsourcing research in some way in our companies so that people are doing this, maybe even evaluative research on their own, independent of researchers, but it funnels up into this big repository or database of everything we know about customers, but it didn't rely on us and our time and our recruiting and all that stuff to do. All of a sudden, research becomes a lot more strategic. And in fact, research is no longer a thing we add to projects. Research is something we do as a company to make better decisions, to better serve the people who decide to work with us. All of this, for me, leads to a future where empathy becomes the strategic advantage. Our ability to be human and care for people that we work with and for becomes the thing that wins. Thank you very much. You have to, I'm asking you to indulge me. I do this every talk I give now. Hey! Thank you very much. Okay, we've got about 15 minutes left for questions. That's intentional, so please fire away.
So, I have a question about...
Too fast.
Yay, it works. Okay, so my question is about the crowdsourcing throughout an organization. I actually went through this when I was a designer and then had too much demand and was giving people templates and you can do it.
Yeah.
And some people were into it because it empowered them, and some people were just kind of grumbly about it. So
Sure.
I was wondering, in terms of experience of not just adding more work, but actually having people feel excited about having the power to do this for themselves.
Definitely. Okay, so to repeat the question, just like sometimes people get grumpy about asking them to do other stuff in their job.
Yeah,
in some
just
way, right?
how would you crowdsource so that it's seen as an opportunity to help them versus just adding more work to people's plates?
Definitely. I think there's a couple things there. I'll share a little bit deeper story too that Lindsay talked with us on our podcast about. But for me, my answer is that has to be expectations in the culture and the team and the people working there, right? So, because it can't just be us coming through and going like, well, cool, I want you to do part of my job. Are you cool with that, right? Because then that's how some people might see it. It's like, I got enough shit to worry about. I don't want to do research too. It has to be part of the culture where everybody agrees and accepts that, like, well, the key to our success is understanding people really well, and we all agree that, like, that doesn't scale unless we're all part of it, and we know that that leads to success. And I understand that that answer is, there's a lot packed into that, and there's a lot that goes into it. And again, as part of the design field, we like to talk about, like, culture and behavior change. It's hard. So I'm not just, it's easy for me to stand on stage and go like, oh, just change the culture. But it has to be part of that, right? And so I think working, getting one team at the very least, getting one team doing that, and then, you know, screaming that from the mountaintop at your company and say, well, look, they're doing their own, and then we're becoming this place where it just kind of funnels up to, and we help curate and redistribute where necessary. And that goes into part of my answer of what's happening with Lindsay at Envision is she quite literally does not do the evaluative research for, like, usability testing stuff for product teams. What she does, her role, and she sees herself as, like, the person who cheerleads everybody else and gives those tools and templates and ability and that knowledge to do this work themselves, so that she can then help redistribute that. And it works because the work she's doing, the research she's doing, is quite literally going to the board of Envision. Like, that's what she spends her time doing. And that's what all of us in this room ought to spend our time doing. And that's what I advocate for, but hopefully that answers your question a bit. Yes?
So I think you hit on a really important issue facing researchers. I've worked for two corporations, and one of the challenges that large corporations have is the volume of research that has to be done, especially if you're thinking about healthcare. I work in the medical device sector. It's a mandatory requirement for anything that gets released that you do robust research, right? Because your product simply will not get approved. So part of the challenge when you work for large organizations, and there's a lot of mergers and acquisitions in the space, is that every business is siloed. So you will have 3 businesses who are doing research, spending whatever amount of money on the same question.
Yes.
And that is, I think, where what you've highlighted, right? If you buy and you don't have action tied to it, what is the business going to do? They're going to say, I don't see value in this. I'm not going to pay for it anymore, right? Yeah. But the key challenge there is the operations piece that I think you spoke about. How do you create a knowledge management system? Yeah. Because that's really what's needed, that allows for a repository of information across the organization so that those things can be tied together. Yes. And one of the challenges with that is if you think about certain types of user research, take the example of contextual inquiry, one study can generate terabytes of data. Okay, that terabyte of video data is actually more important than the report. So if I have to go to my organization and say, you really need to work on a knowledge management system, oh, and by the way, every study that you do might generate a terabyte of data. Now, all of a sudden, they have to really think about, well, how are we going to curate that in a way that doesn't pose a storage problem? Yeah. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what are the ways that we as researchers need to be thinking about creating a knowledge operation system? Because it's actually really important. Eli Lilly did this, and they've seen huge returns on investment. Yeah. So that's one. And 2, how can you have an intelligent conversation understanding the execution part of it, which is actually a pretty big challenge, right? It's not as simple as we're going to create a repository. Okay, I'm in healthcare. It's got to be HIPAA compliant. Yeah. Right? So I can't go to any old cloud server. That cloud server's got to guarantee me that data is not going to get hacked. Totally. So just curious from your perspective how you would approach that.
Totally. Knew that was coming. I'll give you the Reader's Digest version. It's really hard. So my longer answer to that, so we hear this all the time with people that we even talk to with our own company. So what we're seeing right now is that people are actually using, and I referenced this a little bit in the talk of like trying to hack existing tools to cobble some of this together, Yes, because the challenge is particularly for you in a highly regulated industry is there's like, well, here's these 5 tools we can use, and that's it, right? So one of the things that we see people doing, and again, this is a bit nebulous, but it's worth saying, is just start. Because one of the things, and I'm part of the group here. Trust me, it's a safe space, but I'm going to criticize us for a minute. We're a bit navel gazers, right? We like to sit and try to figure out the right solution until the boat is past where nobody's actually interested in solving that anymore. So one of the things I advocate is just simply starting. That's a little bit difficult in a highly regulated industry, but irrespective of that, one of the things that we see are people just proving out with anything. Just start doing it. Just start creating these nuggets and these insights and this repository of sorts to start showing the value. Because when you get enough groundswell and sort of momentum behind that, then all of a sudden the conversation begins to change, and maybe things like, maybe not in your case, but like security and regulations, all this stuff start to loosen up because it's like, well, this problem's enough worth solving where the risk is actually not as big anymore. Does that make sense? Not for you. Not for you. But we have, yeah, totally. I'm just saying what we've seen in some other companies is they're like, well, we're just going to do this thing very small and just start doing it. You know what I mean? In your particular case, I might recommend wherever you can store that kind of data. You're doing research today, so it lives somewhere, right? Being a little bit more mindful of like creating that system. We do not have enough time to talk about how that works with a new terabyte of data each time, but yeah, it's tough, particularly in your situation because we want that, we want to get after that, but your hands are really tied in the regulations and stuff that you've got. All I can say is I empathize, no pun intended. Yeah, well, we have a couple. Fight for it.
Awesome. So actually, I have a request. Can you go back one slide?
We'll see.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. I was going to ask you with the, you've got your nuggets, and it really feels just like what Jim was talking about with like telling a quick story.
Totally.
And so, on the phone driving yesterday, and someone from a large search company that will remain nameless, you'd never think of, was like, oh, well, I didn't know that was, that little story about that project too. And so how are you trying to create that little story that all these more senior people can connect with?
Yeah, absolutely. So the one thing is, and that kind of goes back to answering your question, is just start having those available to use and sort of repurpose and curate. Because the fact of the matter is, what you're really getting to is there's things we learn that we want to put into a report, but there's a whole bunch of stuff that we learn that never made it into that. And so where does that narrative go? So just having it available, if it's in something like Aurelius or not, doesn't matter, right? But like having that available to sort of reconjure that is the idea here. I can tell you certainly the things that we are doing is that, well, those key insights exist, searchable, taggable, across everything. And then what we have, it's actually one of our newest features, it's called a collection. So when somebody goes and asks you that question, hey, do we have any research on, you can search for that, gather all those key insights, put it into a collection, give it a description, and say, yes, we do, take a look at that. It's just like a playlist in Tomer's Polaris product. So yeah, for sure. And that's actually how we see a lot of people using this. And that's the value they get is because they know inevitably what's going to happen is whatever they did and learn the research, and after they're done with the meeting talking about the thing that they did, there's a whole lot more impact that ought to have. And they don't want to be spending the time trying to re-go through that. And that's the way we're trying to help people solve that problem. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Awesome. Let's go right here, and then over there, one of the two.
You touched a little bit on this concept that research needs to be democratized and become less formal, and that's where it's going, right? How do you encourage that and help people empathize with your users and still maintain a certain threshold of quality?
Yeah.
So that there's not garbage in, garbage out,
Yeah.
without creating a research police, if you will.
Absolutely. I think that's a great question. And just to clarify, too, like what I'm recommending here and it becoming less formal is only by way of its communication. I'm not at all advocating that we could become less rigorous about the way we do research, although there's something to be said to understanding, well, we work in software. If we get it wrong, we can probably fix it tomorrow. Not in your industry. Please don't do that. But for the most part, right, like if we're working in that, like understanding like right up to the line where we won't fall off and make lousy research. So yeah, it's a point of clarification for me actually is meeting people where they are and where they expect and how they expect to be communicated is the real point to be taken away from that. Be still very rigorous in how you synthesize and figure out what you learned, but lower the barrier of entry for people to do their own, right, as well as to consume what it is that you learned, and it'll grease the skids for it to have a greater impact. Does that answer your question? Cool. I promised that we'd go over here. There was a couple hands up.
Thank you so much for speaking today. I really appreciate you also talking about empathy so often.
Yeah.
As researchers, I feel like we're often called to empathize with not only coworkers, but the people who we're advocating for in our organization, as our end users and various other parties. But sometimes, personally, I get a little worried that empathy is only towards a certain end, in that we're empathetic in order to embody better manipulation. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how empathy relates to manipulation and how it can maybe go beyond just manipulating other people.
Yeah, that's a great question. Just to re-summarize, empathy. Wait a minute. So what's when we timing me? This is 4 minutes. Don't tell me. It's a great question. Just to re-summarize, how empathy can be used and employed for not so nice means, right? That's why the last slide I had is what it was, because I think if more people genuinely understand the people they're doing things, in some cases to or for, generally speaking, the world is not evil. And most times, I actually give another talk. It's very much about this in building empathy for your stakeholders. Is that a lot of times people are not intentionally malicious. They're not actually evil people. They're just making the best decision with the information and tools and sort of resources that they know how. And I believe most problems in the world are solved through education. Building empathy in the work that we do is educating people. Here's the ramifications that this has. At that point, if decisions and the course of actions don't change, then you have a different problem on your hands, right? But I've seen firsthand anyway, by and large, generally they do. So all of that is to say, we have a hard job, but we can do it and we will. Let's come back over here. Thank you for that, by the way. Thank you very much.
So you can hear me? Okay,
Yes.
yeah. So not to be specific to your product necessarily, but just in general, you spoke about a library and being able to be a searchable, usable repository. So I just want to know, from your experience, either doing research within your company or with, outside people, how are people getting like the most bang for their buck? Because so many places that I've worked and I've colleagues who've worked at, they keep having this intention and they create like a whole folder system, a whole library, but maybe because things weren't tagged well to begin with, or people don't know it's there. Like that's why people say, oh, it's easier to just do the research from scratch. It's not that they don't think they have it. It's that finding it.
Yes.
So can you just talk a little bit more about like the use of a library and the importance of, the different components to make it maximally useful, especially across an organization?
Sure. I think in some ways you actually already answered your own question, which is totally fine. But I'll just kind of extend beyond that. What it is having it in a little bit more. So again, as Tomer sort of says, that atomizing research and this like continuous research. Don't think of it as like, well, there's an effort that we're going to start and end, and then there was learning. So if it's a paradigm shift even from how a lot of us have done our work, right? Where there's actually just these nuggets or these bits and bots that we're learning that's amassing into this larger system. That's part of the reason why, and I promise it wasn't like weasel words answer of like just start, because it's hard to break ourselves out of that pattern in some ways. Where like we're just going to make this report because the research is done. But if you look at it as more of like a continuous effort. Now the tool, I will do my best not to answer specific to ours, but basically. I mean, I have to answer and say this, just like call it out for what it is. When you're hacking an existing tool to try to solve a problem it wasn't made for, that's where we run into a lot of problems. And then that idea dies on the vine. So that's what we actually see a lot without being too specific to ours. You know what I mean? So it also then takes, so imagine if you're distributing this effort of doing the research and this stuff across many teams, then you can become the person that's helping curate and manage that beautiful garden that you want to grow, right? And because a lot of times that's what happens too, is that we don't have enough time and resource because we're actively doing the work to then make sure the work can go beyond that. So that's the best answer I think I would give at the moment. You seem unsatisfied. It is.
I guess I was hoping for you to say something like, if we teach people more about tagging, we've had experience where then people use the library.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
An answer, but I know that's very
Totally fair.
specific, but you don't have to continue. Like, I don't want
No. No. I mean, I'm here. I love talking about this. I mean, so just that's totally right. Yes, if you have some agreed upon general sense of vocabulary and you have a tool that facilitates that well, that's a great place to start. But yeah, I'm 30 seconds over, and I don't want to get yelled at by anybody else. Thank you all so much for taking the time to listen to me today.